Thank you very much for coming along to the launch of the findings for the Young Life and Times and Kids Life and Times survey that we held in 2018. So some very familiar faces who've been here probably for the last 15 years or longer, like myself. Some new faces, some young people who took part in the Young Life and Times survey. It's always particularly nice to see some of you coming along, so thank you very much for that. The format of today's event is that we present you with some of the core findings. Okay, the data, all the data for both surveys will be available online as always after this event. So as will be the data sets and the technical reports, so you can have a look at that and the data that you're particularly interested in. So the format is we will speak for about 40 minutes or so today. If that clicker is working, not after. Is it working now? Okay. The official presentation will be videoed by a mic over there. We make this available for people who can't attend online on our ARC YouTube channel. The discussion afterwards will not be videoed, okay? So it'll be an open discussion with questions, so we will not record that. It's just a presentation that we will record, just to let you know. Okay, so Young Life and Times is an annual survey of 16-year-olds that we've run since 2003. Okay, we're using the Child Benefit Register for that to draw a random sample of 16-year-olds every year. So in 2018, we picked everybody who was born from January to March and invited them to take part in the survey. They received a postal questionnaire, which they could send back to us with an option to complete online as well. We had 1,152 completions last year. We actually had two surveys. We had a split survey because so many people wanted us to ask questions on behalf of them and funded questions on behalf of them, so not everybody completed all the questions. Some questions were completed by everybody, but some weren't. Kids Life and Times, it's a survey, an online survey of P7 children. Everybody who's in P7 is invited to take part. It's a school-based survey, and children complete that in school on their iPads or computers, as you could see on the first slide. So again, we had a split sample, again due to the level of funding that we had last year, and so some children responded to some questions, some responded to other questions. Some children, the children got. Some of the questions were answered by all of the children. We had 5,300 completions, which is a completion rate of 21%, and of course we are seeking parental opt-out. So both surveys are run by ARC, which is a joint initiative by Ulster University and Queen's University, which was established in 2000. That's two of three surveys that we run. We also run the Life and Time survey, which is an annual survey of adults. Okay, in terms of today, so these are the questions that were included in the surveys. So some background questions that everybody completes. We had questions on well-being, which were funded by the Department of Education. They were both asked in Young Life and Times and Kids Life and Times, as were questions on shared education and community relations, equality and diversity education, as were questions funded by the UNESCO Center at Ulster University on citizenship. And we have Una O'Connor here today, who will give the keynote when I'm finished with some of the background stuff here, who will talk about key findings in relation to children's young people's attitudes and experiences with regard to citizenship. We also had funding from the Department of Justice, who currently funds both the Young Life and Times survey and the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, and ask questions about attitudes to paramilitaries and community safety. And we were delighted to have questions on participation in research. Nobody really has ever asked children about their attitudes and experiences of actually taking part in research. And Katrina, who's a KLT director, will talk about that later. And she will also talk a little bit about attitudes to language learning. Okay, Brexit is coming, so a second language might be handy to have. So let's see what the kids' experiences are. And of course, we've been long-term funded by the Executive Office in relation to attitudes to community relations, minority ethnic groups, and I'm going to talk about just the time series of that as well. So in terms of background, these are the background data for the Kids Life and Times kids who've taken part in the survey. As you can see, it's 50-50 boys, girls. Much easier to get that if you actually have a school-based survey that is completed in a classroom. So you will see it's much harder to get that in Young Life and Times. No coincidence that we have 2 females attending here today who took part in Young Life and Times and no male. So Northern Irish identity, 56%. So the majority of kids identify as Northern Irish. Okay. Ulster British, 16% Irish, 20%. And then, of course, we have newcomer children as well who may identify as Polish or Chinese and so forth. Most of the children, just over 3/4, live with their mum and dad. But some, of course, live either with their mother only or with their father only, or part of the time with their father and part of the time with their mother. In terms of school type, we have a very good representation of children's background as well. About half of them attend Catholic maintained schools. About 43% attend state-controlled schools, which are, of course, as most of you know, predominantly Protestant schools. And we have 5% of kids who attended integrated schools. And we also pick up children who are not in mainstream schooling as well. And that's the same with Young Life and Times, as you will see in a minute. So that's a background for Young Life and Times respondents. As I said, the gender balance is very different. It's much easier to convince girls to take part in research. Maybe we have to offer the boys more money, I don't know. So 60-40. And we are increasingly picking up about 1% of young people who don't identify as girl or boy, so identify as gender fluid or transgender. So that has been, we've included that option for about 5 years now, and it's sort of consistently 1% with a tendency of slightly increasing. Okay, so again, we're picking up reasonably well the background of kids in terms of school attendance, 52% grammar school, slightly higher than the actual numbers are in Northern Ireland, but not very much higher. 29% is secondary school, and of course a lot of the 16-year-olds have already left school, so they're in further education, and 6% in plant integrated school. I think the official figure is 7%, so we picked this up pretty accurately. In terms of religious background, 34%, a third now identify, of 16-year-olds identify now as having no religious background. And if you go back to 2003, which is of course something you can do if you run a survey over such a long period of time, that has increased from about 1/4 in 2003 to 34%. So we see increasing numbers of young people identifying as having no religious background. So these are the findings we're going to present today. Okay, I'll talk very briefly, just a couple of slides about Brexit and attitudes to Brexit. These were asked in all 3 surveys last year. I'm only talking about Young Life and Times and Kids Life and Times today. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the time series data, because I know there are people in the room here who are really interested in community relations and peace. There's another big event on upstairs in the 4th floor from SEUPB today, so this is really something important. And then I'm going to hand over to Una O'Connor for the keynote speech today on children's and young people's experiences on citizenship education and political literacy, and I'm sure you'll find that really interesting. And then Katrina will finish off with some of the key findings in relation to kids' experience of taking part in research, and I'm really looking forward to that, and language learning as well. So that's the plan. Okay, Brexit. Okay, who knows what's next? It looks pretty much we're going to have Johnson maybe as a prime minister, and he seems to be sure that the UK will exit the European Union in October. This is what young people think about this, you know, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Okay, you can see that if you ask the children, there is actually, you know, one of the arguments is that high affluence children are more likely to say that they would prefer Remain, and low affluence children are more likely to prefer Brexit. Now, our data actually shows that there's very little difference between affluence of families, whether they think it's a good idea or not. The difference is that the children from low affluence backgrounds are not sure. Okay, so they're much more likely to say they're not sure. It is true that high affluence children are more likely to say it's a bad idea, but it's not offset by low affluence children saying it's a good idea. It's the fact that they're not sure whether it's a good idea or not. So that's where the main difference is. Okay. Now, if you look at national identity, there are a few surprises here, as you can imagine. So those who identify as Irish are most likely to say that it's a bad idea. Those who identify as British are least likely to say that it's a good idea. But really what we're looking at here, and again look at the British, is the uncertainty that they're not sure whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. That's where we see the differences. Okay. Now, looking at the same data for 16-year-olds, Young Life and Times respondents, the question was slightly differently worded. It was whether they'd be in favor of the UK leaving the EU, opposed to the UK leaving the EU, or whether they're not sure whether the UK should leave the EU. Again, we find, similarly to Kids' Life and Times, that the difference is not in favor of being leaving the EU. The difference is in the uncertainty. Okay, so those who are from not well-off backgrounds were much more likely to say they're not sure whether it's a good idea or not. So that's the difference, as you can see in the third row here. So the well-off are the ones who are most opposed, and that's what we always argued and heard. But it's not the case that the not well-off are statistically significantly more likely to be in favor. They are statistically more likely to be not sure whether it's a good idea or not. Okay, the same again if you look at religious background, you find the same. This one here is looking though at whether we think that children or young people, 16-year-olds, should have had a vote. Of course it didn't, as you know. And we found that the Catholics amongst the 16-year-olds were much more likely than the Protestants to say that young people should have had a vote in the decision. Of course, we know we have a big event coming up this year with the UNCRC in November, a big anniversary. I'm sure we'll talk about children's rights a lot this year. And as you know, children's rights, UNCRC says that children and young people should be having a say in matters that affect them. Very few people would argue that Brexit won't affect them, of course. So that's where this comes from. So if you were holding another Brexit referendum and 16-year-olds were able to vote, how would you vote? Okay, 72% of the 16-year-olds who took part in Young Life and Times said they would vote Remain. Okay, 12% said they would leave. I'm not sure if that makes much of a difference in terms of the political decisions that are being made, but it's interesting to see how young people feel about that. Okay. So I'm going to have 5 slides now on some of the community relation data before I hand over to Una. Okay. One of the advantages of running a survey like Kids' Life and Times and Life and Times and Young Life and Times over so many years is that we can monitor changes in attitudes. Okay? So if you ask the questions every year, it's interesting to see how the mood amongst respondents changes in relation to the peace process and community relations. And the first slide here shows the proportion of young people broken down by religious background who say that the relations between Protestants and Catholics are now better than they were 5 years ago. Okay. And you can see that for the last 3 years, 2015, 16, 17, 18, we've seen a slight drop across all religious backgrounds. Okay. And if you compare 2003 with 2018, 2018 is the year, last year, where Catholics were least likely to say that relations are better now than they were 5 years ago. Okay. The Protestants in 2018 were about 5% more likely, as you can see in the table below, to say that relations are better. And those who have no religious background were, compared to 2003, when we asked the question for the first time, were about 6% more likely to say in 2018 that relations are better. Okay, but it's very clear if you look in the middle there, 2008-9, when we had a height in relation to community relations and the perceptions, that we are on a downward drop at the moment. Okay, And it's particularly noticeable for the Catholics and their attitudes. So will the relations be better in 5 years' time? So this is looking at the optimism now. And the drop is even more noticeable than the assessment of the relations compared to 5 years ago. So 20% fewer Catholics than 2003 in 2018 think that relations will be better in 5 years' time. So that's less than a third of the Catholics in 2018 now saying that the relations will be better in 5 years' time. Okay. Only just about a quarter of the Protestants said that, 28%. Again, we have the lowest proportion ever of Protestants in 2008 saying that the relations will be better in 5 years' time. And if you look at those with no religion, again, it's about a third. So what is noticeable is that the attitudes between the Catholics, Protestants, and those with no religion have sort of come together. Okay, so they almost have the same level of optimism now compared to, say, 2007 and 2018. But the level of optimism is decreasing. So will religion then always make a difference? No, there's very little change since 2003 in relation to the optimism. We had a bit of a drop in 2017 last year, and we were not really quite sure what that was and why that was, but we are back up at over 3/4 in 2018 saying that religion will always make a difference. So if you were drawing a straight line through that, there is a decreasing proportion of young people thinking that religion will always make a difference to how people feel about each other. But really, it's pretty stable over the last 16 years that we've run the survey. There is, however, good news still, okay? And this is looking at young people's preferences of mixed religion environments. And there is no drop in relation to that, okay? So this figure shows that the proportion of young people who want to go to mixed religious school, who want to live in mixed religion neighborhoods, want to work in a mixed religion workplace is slightly increasing and is really stable. There's no drop. So they are less optimistic about the relations, but they're, in terms of their own ambitions of being in mixed religion environments and work, school, and neighborhood, there's no change. Okay, so the majority want to do that, want to be in mixed religion environments. When it comes to assessing the relation towards the other main religious community, okay, Catholics, relations towards Protestants, Protestants' relations towards Catholics, and those of no religions, this figure here compares the 2003 data with the data from last year and 2018. Okay, and again, it's probably more interesting to look at 2003 compared to, so the first Young Life and Times survey compared to 2018, the last year's Young Life and Times survey. You can see that amongst the Catholics, there's very little change, as is there between the Protestants, as is there between for those with no religious backgrounds. Okay, so in 2003, young people were just as likely to say they feel favorable towards Catholics or Protestants and those with no religion as they did in 2018. So there's no change over time. Okay, if you look at minority ethnic communities, there is some change over time. Okay, as you can see here, the red line and the black line cross over in 2013-14. Okay, so there's now a much higher proportion of 16-year-olds saying that they feel favorable towards people from minority ethnic groups than people saying that they feel neither favorable or non-favorable. Okay, and there's no significant increase amongst those who say they feel unfavorable towards people from minority ethnic groups. You can see here in 2016-17, the green and the purple line at the bottom, there's a slight change, but statistically speaking, there is no difference. Okay, so if you compare that with 2004, which is the first time we asked that question, so 5% and 6%, 9% and 7%, so statistically, that difference could just be by chance. Something that is a reasonably new initiative is the participation in TBUC summer camps. Okay, and the executive office has asked us to ask those questions for the last couple of years, and I'm comparing 2017 with 2018. So this is looking at participation in summer camps, good relation summer camps, or TBUC camps. Okay, you can see that between 2017 and 18, there's very little difference. Okay, so the participation is about a third, 30%. Someone from the family has taken part, about 6-7%, and then some young people take part as well as their family members. So there's very little difference. There is, however, a difference in relation to the feeling towards others after the participation in the camp. And we see here that last year we reported that a very high proportion, 41%, said they felt no different really after the camp, which is not the desirable outcome. In 2018, we found that this proportion has really reduced. Only 18% in 2018 said they felt no different, and the proportion of those who said they feel more positive have increased, okay, to 53%. So in 2018, over half of the participants who took part in the summer camps said they felt more positive towards the other community after that. Okay, that's already the end of the community relations questions. I'm delighted to hand over to Ina now. Ina, if you want to come up and present.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the chance to share the findings of the citizenship and political literacy data that we administered through the Young Life and Times and the Kids Life and Times survey this year. It was done as part of the UNESCO Centre internal university funding, which allowed us to administer these two modules, and it was interesting for us, the data that came out of it. Just by way of a little bit of background, there was a timeliness in terms of our impetus for wanting to ask the questions in and around citizenship, education and political literacy. 2017, for example, it was marked 10 years from the introduction of both personal development and mutual understanding, PDMU, and local and global citizenship into what was the new revised curriculum at that point. We also then had the 2018 anniversary of 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. 2019, depressingly, has also been 2.5 years and counting since we've had a functioning Assembly and Executive. 2019 also was 50 years since the voting age was reduced to 18. So there was quite a bit of symmetry in terms of the questions that we wanted to ask, both in the Kids Life and Times and the Young Life and Times, in relation to young people's understanding of civics and citizenship issues and their political literacy. This is just by way of sort of giving a snapshot of both what children and young people really would be exposed to in primary school and post-primary school curriculum. I mean, as I said, both the PDMU and the citizenship curriculums were introduced as part of the new curriculum in 2007, and they covered common themes such as participation, human rights and freedoms, and aspects of political literacy. And the curriculum content of both of the subject areas is incremental, reflecting the age trajectory in both primary and post-primary schools. But the two subject areas are also united in a kind of a curricular intent, which is really to encourage pupils to become confident, informed and participatory citizens within the 21st century, able to make informed and responsible choices and decisions throughout their lives. So that was the underpinning rationale behind our questions. The module overview, subject to obviously the wording of certain questions and certain elements of questions that we could keep in one or both of the surveys. The main themes that we talked about or that we questioned the children about in both modules was about what they learned in school, particularly specifically in their PDMU and their citizenship lessons, what their views were on the voting age, and it's interesting, Derek having just alluded to that in terms of the Brexit question, their views on Northern Ireland politics and politicians, constitutional question in terms of where Northern Ireland should be governed from, then also subsequent questions on political and social activism, their use of social media, particularly in terms of finding news and how they made sense of news, and then also their trust and information sources. So again, because we're time bound today, and obviously we can't go into everything, the 4 areas highlighted in red are just a snapshot of some of the findings that came out of those particular areas. In terms of the topics then covered in school, The data from the 2 modules, and I've highlighted some of the more interesting responses in red, showed some variation in terms of what is covered in primary and post-primary school. So, for example, you'll see there's a high level of don't know responses in relation to the various topics amongst the younger pupils, as well as arguably lower engagement with more sensitive issues. For example, less than half of the pupils had said that they had covered the Northern Ireland conflict in their PDMU lessons. Whereas there was more attention given to what you might call more universal subject areas or more acceptable areas of human rights and global poverty. The pattern is repeated to some extent in the Young Life and Times data, although the overall topics responses are much higher, which, as you will see, with their coverage of the Northern Ireland conflict, is actually in the top 3 of the topics that are covered in citizenship lessons in post-primary schools. Just by way of an aside, although I don't have a slide on it, we did ask the children another follow-on question of not just the topics they do in school, but then what kind of civic participation are you involved in inside or outside school? And from the Kids' Life and Time responses, about 1/3 of the pupils said that they hadn't been involved in any kind of civic participation, but 2/3 did, which was good. Now, it was mainly in terms of membership of school councils, listening to talks given by local charities and local organisations, and raising funds for charity. Within the Young Life and Times, there was a higher rate of reported civic participation. Broadly the same areas of the Kids' Life and Times, but you could also see then beginning to emerge maybe a more active political participation. Pupils from the Young Life and Times, for example, had signed online petitions. Some had joined campaign groups online, or they had visited the website of a political party. Although within that group there was still quite a high proportion of hadn't taken part in any political participation at all. When we moved on then to ask, sorry, the figures haven't come up there, to ask about how much did they know about politics in Northern Ireland. The highest proportion, and I haven't got my glasses so I can't see my figures, I do apologise. The highest proportion was I just know a little, and then I know a lot and I don't know anything at all. Boys were considerably more likely than girls to say that they knew a lot about politics in response to that question. We then moved on to the questions that we asked. In Young Life and Times, we asked the children, are politicians doing a good job? And in the Young Life and Times, it was, are the politicians representing your political opinions? So in the Kids' Life and Times, as you will see, just 16% of the children thought that the politicians were doing a good job in comparison to those who said no and don't know. And responses to those were sort of more or less evenly based gender-wise. I'm just going to flick on to the next question, and I'll flick back to the Young Life and Times. The same question then, we asked the children to elaborate a bit in terms of whether politicians were doing a good job or not, so we included an open-ended question. And as you will see from the word cloud, an awful lot of the themes that come up again and again and again. You'll see Brexit in the middle of it. Nothing, as in the politicians are doing absolutely nothing. Theresa May come up quite a bit. Fighting, that all they do is fight with one another. Really hard to pick out. There were so many very, very rich quotes and qualitative data that come out from this question, but just 3 to give you a sense of what the children in the Kids' Life and Time survey said. So we had something like they're always having arguments with each other and not focusing on their jobs. Someone else said it's all just become a big mess and they don't know how to get themselves out of it. And then someone else said, I don't think our politicians are doing a good job at the minute because nobody can agree on anything and they're all fighting for what they want instead of what the country needs. So there were some, I mean, that's just 3 out of about 100, 150, 200 responses, and it's, as I say, it was really hard to pick out the best ones because they were all so very, very good, and it would be interesting to go back in and really look at those qualitative responses in more detail. So those young people in the Kids' Life and Times certainly had an insight and an understanding and wanted to express their views and had an opinion on it. So if I just flick back to the slide again, whenever we kind of asked a complementary question then to do Northern Ireland political parties and politicians represent your political theme, you will see that in Young Life and Times, there's a more sort of nuanced response to there. Only 26% saying yes, 28% saying no, and then 46% saying don't know. Of those, we're still very much in the preliminary sort of delving into the data analysis of all of this, but of those children or those young people who said yes, the numbers of Catholic pupils were higher at 44% than the numbers of Protestant pupils, who were just 27%, and pupils of no religion, who were at 28%. So that was something, and I'll come back to that whenever we go into the voting question. One of the questions we also then wanted to ask both the Kids Life and Times and the Young Life and Times pupils was what their thoughts were on the voting age. And again, it's quite apt. There's nice symmetry considering Dirk's question earlier. So you'll just see the slight difference between the Kids Life and Times responses and the Young Life and Times responses. So in Kids Life and Times, there was a very strong consensus, almost 2/3 of responses, that the age of voting should be lowered to 16 years or below. And there was a fairly even balance between the boys and the girls' responses to that. But what was interesting then has been, I suppose, the change of response in terms of age progression. So the very low proportion of don't knows, for example, in Kids Life and Times, it's a more obvious don't know in the Young Life and Times. So whereas the Kids Life and Times had a very strong opinion about this, it contrasted with the higher rate of don't knows or knows in the Young Life and Times responses. Just that higher proportion of pupils who felt that they couldn't or shouldn't be able to vote until the age of 18. Now again, it's sort of, I suppose, trying to sort of get a sense of is that just, you know, a developing political literacy, or what is it that has raised their opinion on that? But that's something that we do want to explore further in the data analysis. In relation then to the voting age, we had the same idea. We opened up an open-ended question in the survey just to ask why, you know, give us a reason for your response. So again, you will see not a lot of things about like old enough, maturity, opinions, you know, being able to think and make decisions. And again, it was being able to lift out an awful lot of very, very rich responses to this question as well. So for example, just to be reflective of the sort of the tendency towards we need to be 18. 16 is too young. I feel people may not be fully educated on the topic and so cannot make an informed choice. Whereas somebody else would have said 16-year-olds are entirely capable of forming political opinions, and not allowing them to vote silences almost an entire generation. And then someone said a lot of young people don't know the history of Northern Ireland, or don't watch the news or anything to know what they're voting for. So again, some of the insights were really, really profound in terms of the open-ended questions and the sense of what the young people thought about voting and the whole voting system and their readiness to vote as well. We also then, sorry, I'm going to go back because I realised there was another slide that we had asked them about if the politicians, if we go back previously. Back. So do the parties or the politicians represent your political opinions? We had also asked who of the political parties would best represent their opinions. And the Catholic pupils who responded in the Young Life and Times opinion were slightly more likely than the Protestants to agree that political parties currently represented their political opinions, just slightly more. And those of no religion were least likely to say that the political parties represented their opinion. However, there was also a very high don't know response rate there too. Almost half of the young people said they didn't know. What did come out whenever they were asked to say which of the political parties best represent your political opinion, there were the sort of the traditional movement towards some of the more obvious political parties, but a very clear emergence of both the Alliance and the Green Party became evident in terms of who represented your political views. Of those who did reply, nationalist stroke Republican parties were more strongly represented than unionist parties as well. So that's something that again we want to look at in a little bit more detail. And then finally, we did have a question on the Constitution, just again asking it of both Kids Life and Times and Young Life and Times. And it really was just straightforward. Do you think Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK? Should it be jointly governed or part of the Ireland, Republic of Ireland, or should it be jointly governed by the UK and Northern Ireland? So in some senses, the UK and Republic of Ireland question or responses did largely adhere to fairly traditional response rates. But the joint governance one, when we ever began to analyse it, it threw up a little bit more of a nuanced response, again, that we really do want to look at a wee bit more. For the purposes of this presentation, just going to really look at the kind of the strongly agree and the agree responses. So inevitably, in Kids Life and Times, that Northern Ireland should stay part of the UK. The agreement was higher amongst the controlled pupils compared to pupils who were at maintained schools. And that was also reflected in the Young Life and Times responses as well. Similarly, whether Northern Ireland should be governed by, by the Republic, the agree and the strongly agree was higher amongst maintained pupils who went to maintained schools compared to pupils who were at controlled schools. And then in response to the joint government, there was actually a closer agreement in the Kids Life and Time survey between controlled and maintained pupils. So for example, 43% of maintained pupils and 49% of controlled pupils agreed that, of those who did agree, said it should be jointly governed. And the Life and Time, or the Young Life and Time, it was slightly different. It was highest, the rate of agreement was highest amongst pupils from Catholic backgrounds at 49%, followed by pupils of no religion at 39% and Protestant children at 11%. So there was more of a subtle difference there as well. There's quite a lot of data in terms of the responses to that question, given that we were giving the children 3 options. But again, it's something that we really do want to begin to unpick in a little bit more detail. We're still in the process, as I say, of doing that data analysis. Our data, Dirk has kindly agreed that we're going to have the summer to really go into it in a bit more detail. So full analysis of that data and the results and all will be available in September. But in the meantime, if anybody wanted to ask us any questions about the modules or the survey questions, or just want a wee bit more information on the background to how we develop them, where you can email me, and it was very much a team effort within the UNESCO Centre. So if not me, somebody else would be able to provide you with the information. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Una. That was absolutely fascinating. It's lovely to see all the data that we've collected all being brought together by an expert in the area. So we're great at doing all the data collection, and we rely very much on people like yourself who can bring that context and make this interesting above and beyond just the actual figures themselves. Okay, so I'm going to talk, before I talk about modern languages and children's attitudes to taking part in research, I just want to present a slide here on well-being. We asked some questions that were funded by Department for Education in both the Kids Life and Times and the Young Life and Times. We haven't given DE all of the analysis yet, but I just wanted to give you some sense of what is coming out of the data on well-being. So there were about 34 questions that we asked in each of the surveys, and they were based on the PISA supplementary data that came out a few years ago. And of those 34 questions, they are divided into domains. So we're getting a broad range of children's well-being. how they feel about themselves in a number of different areas that are important to their lives. So the key thing that coming out of this, each of these domains will have a mean score, and in and of itself a mean score doesn't mean a lot. But when you look at the comparison between the groups, when you look at the comparison between Young Life and Times, 16-year-olds, and Kids Life and Times, who are 10 and 11 years old, you'll see that what has happened, and this supports all previous research, that well-being in almost all areas decreases as children age. So among the Kids Life and Times respondents, in each of these, higher scores, except for the bottom two there, mean better well-being. So they mean that they're higher, so they're more optimistic. The younger children, they have higher life satisfaction, measuring their happiness, so they are happier. They are more empathetic. They have higher self-esteem. They have more pro-social behaviour. Actually, that one was not statistic. Those two, the two that weren't statistically significant between the young children and the older children were in terms of pro-social behaviour, and in academic self-concept, the 16-year-olds had a higher self-concept than their peers who were 10 and 11 years old. In terms of belonging at school as well, we had younger children felt part more of their school, partly, you know, some of the 16-year-olds have left school, but nonetheless there's a definite sense that younger children feel they belong within the environment of their school. So there were questions about, I feel I'm important to this school, my teachers respect me in this school. So at primary school level, that is obviously the children, our perception is that that is the case. In terms of sadness and worries in those two domains, they were very highly statistically significant differences between the older children and the younger children. So younger children were less sad and they had less worries. And I guess that makes sense, and it does support all of the previous research that has been carried out into children's well-being. Overall, there were gender differences as well, with girls having poor well-being. Not so much at the younger age, but as they got older, by the time they're 16, there's almost all of the measures, the girls had poorer well-being than the boys. So I think none of that is probably a surprise to those of you who work in the area looking at children and young people's well-being. But we'll do more analysis for DE in terms of other things, other factors that might influence this, because probably, as you're aware, you know, if you think about each year we ask a wellbeing measure in Kids Life and Times. We use KidScreen rather than this measure, but every year we find the same thing. The children who are being bullied at school are much less happy. Their well-being is much poorer. Children who are unhappy at school, there's a very strong relationship between their well-being. So this all backs up what we find every year anyway in Kids Life and Times. But the interesting thing that we have this time is that we have asked it for Kids Life and Times and Young Life and Times, and these findings support every other piece of research that there is out there in terms of their well-being. I think partly now it's time for us now to go beyond this. We know this. We've known this for many years. Some people are now saying, oh, it's all to do with social media. But actually it isn't. Not fully. Because these findings go back a very long way, from days when I did psychology 100 years ago, nearly, feels like it. This hasn't changed. These findings are still the same. And I think now it's time to think about, you know, delving deeper into this. Coming from a quantitative researcher now, that's a big thing, is finding out more from the children themselves and, you know, talking to them, why is this? Why is there this drop, particularly for girls as they get older? And like I said, it's not all to do with social media. We know that has an influence, but there's definitely more to it than that. Okay, so again, these figures are all data are all going to be made available that you can, and so you can begin to maybe do some of this analysis yourself, things that you're interested in when the data are live. Okay, so to move on to something maybe a bit more lighter, something we haven't asked before. We had a half module in Kids Life and Times this year that was looking at languages in school. The context for this is that one of my colleagues, Ian Cullen from Queen's University, who teaches modern languages, has been saying and making the case for a while that Northern Ireland is the only region of the UK where primary school children, it's not compulsory for them to learn a language. As Dirk was saying earlier, you know, there's this whole global world out there. And so Ian is concerned, as many people are, that our children are going to be left behind. So in the Republic of Ireland and across the other 3 regions of the UK, children are required to learn a language, a second language in primary school. So what he wanted to find out, and one of the things we don't know so well, we've had some previous research that has been done that has had smaller samples of children around this age. And what he wanted to do was to do it with a robust study like Kids Life and Times, was to ask the children, oh, sorry, I have no idea what happened there. Does anybody? I don't know. Maybe, no, okay. Sorry, we've lost the link between the 2.
If that happens again, just push this button here. It goes red.
Okay.
That should be back on again.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
No worries.
That's a good tip. I will do that. So what Ian wanted to find out was the extent to which children are learning a language. Obviously, this is all voluntary because it's not compulsory. So what percentage of children in Northern Ireland are actually learning a second language? And 46% said they learned a language at school. The most common languages they learn, there you can see, we Spanish and Irish. And we did ask the children not to consider that if they're in an Irish medium school. So 34% learn Irish. Ian if you saw Ian has a piece in The Conversation presenting some of the findings from this module. And one of the things that he is pointing out is that the fact that quite a small percentage of children do German and French is quite worrying, because those are 2 of the 5 languages that the British Council would suggest are really languages that people need to know in this wider world that these children are growing up in. 18% said they learned some other language, and you can see there that the most language that they learn the most is Mandarin or Chinese. Some do Japanese. Some children said English, or probably children who are in an Irish medium school. So it's really nice to see languages like this, like Chinese, Mandarin, Japanese. Some of the children do Polish. So, you know, it's good to see that some schools are doing it. The problem is, if it's not compulsory, many schools won't have the capacity to do it, or probably are putting more emphasis on other topics. So thinking about whether we think, Ian was interested to see whether children think that you should have to learn a language at school. And 62% of children said they should. And again, this backs up the research that was done in Northern Ireland a few years ago with a smaller sample of children and young people. That they do feel that children should be required to learn a language at primary school. I wanted to have a look at this by gender, simply because we always hear that girls veer more towards languages than boys, certainly around the time of GCSE and choosing their subjects. And what you can see here is there's a tendency already at this age for girls to feel that they should. It's statistically significant, not massively so for such a big sample, but there is still a trend here that's suggesting that girls are slightly more positive about learning a second language. We asked them about whether they were looking forward to either learning a new language in Year 8 or continuing with the language they learned at primary school. And you can see there that, you know, that's a high percentage of children in P7 who think that they are looking forward to it, or they want to continue with the language that they are already learning at primary school. And again, the trend is there in terms of gender. So girls are looking forward to it a little bit more. Again, the difference isn't huge. It's statistically significant, but it's not massive. But it does suggest, again, that trend that is this where it starts? You know, do we need to get them more involved in languages at primary school? Ian would certainly suggest that we do. Because when we were just talking earlier there about children who are bilingual. We have some people in the audience whose children are brought up and they can go from English to Greek, they can go from English to German. And it is such an amazing thing that they can, and they have that for setting them out in this global world. So I think there's a lot there to be learned from this for policymakers, for those who are developing school curriculum in terms of thinking about introducing this and perhaps making this compulsory. We also asked the children who teaches you this language, and it was very rarely their teacher. And over half of the children said it was someone who came in. So we had a great array of names. We had a nice Chinese lady, we had Mrs. Chen, we had Mary from wherever, and so they gave us a wide variety. But it does appear that people are coming in, and that's something maybe that the school is organising, obviously, involuntary, because it's not compulsory, and they're obviously not getting funding towards this. Okay, so on to talk a little bit about taking part in research. Now, this for us, this is working in conjunction with Laura Lundy, who many of you will know is a professor of children's rights at Queen's University. And Laura has developed her Lundy model of children's participation, and she has also, along with Leslie Emerson, they have developed a children's rights-based approach to research. One of the things that we were discussing once at one of our centre meetings was that we know very, very little about how many children do actually take part in research, and actually what they think about it. We make assumptions about things as adults, and there's very little research that is actually asked the children themselves. So we asked them, have you ever taken part in research? And we did have the caveat, of course, it said, apart from this survey. Otherwise, we would have them saying, yeah, 100%, yeah, I'm doing that, no, that's, yeah. So apart from that, have they ever taken part in research before? And over half said they had. So we asked them what type of research had they taken part in, and I think reflecting, us as researchers in terms of all our going into schools, captive audience, quantitative research, surveys, quite a high proportion of the children. They were able to choose as many options as they had been involved in, and it seems that the key way that we are carrying out research with children in schools seems to be through surveys, and particularly online surveys. And it's quite clear the children knew it wasn't that they were just ticking these boxes, because when we asked them something else or asked them what kind of research, it was very clear that we did an NSPCC survey, we did a survey about something. So it's very clear they understand in that sense that this is research that they have taken part in. Some of them have been interviewed by other children, so that would be more like peer research, which I think Dirk has been involved in with the older children. So it's interesting that even within the school context in primary school, some of the children are being interviewed by other children. 15% said they'd taken part in drawing or taking photographs or some other creative techniques. Focus groups and being interviewed by a researcher were slightly lower. So it's clear that it is the surveys that the children are mostly being involved in. One of the interesting things, when we looked at the something else or the other types of research that they've been involved in, it was clear that some of the children were talking about actually being a researcher themselves. So they were saying, I did research on World War II, I did research on birds in the garden. And so Laura was quite interested in that, because she's saying we've got some young researchers, children who are being involved rather than being participants only. These are children who are actually taking part in research themselves and becoming young researchers. So something that hopefully we'll foster, especially those quantitative ones. So we'll do that. Okay, so we asked them about, again, as adults, we hope they enjoy taking part in the research. We do it to find out about their lives. We do it to give them an opportunity, and the CRC, as Dirk was mentioning and Una's mentioned, that children have a right to be involved in their lives and commenting on their own lives. So you can see there, they weren't overwhelmingly jumping up and down for joy. There was, but at least only 4% said they hadn't enjoyed taking part in research at all. Again, it depends, I suppose, on when we do some further analysis on this and the types of research they have taken part in. So Laura and I are meeting tomorrow, and we're going to do some more analysis on this. But at least they do this percentage, over half did actually say they enjoyed it quite a lot or very much. The other thing we always assume, based on all of our thinking around whether it's important to ask children about their lives, about what they think, about taking their views. And in this case, the children were felt that it was important or very important. So we made it clear that taking part in research that was about their lives. And they were quite positive in that sense, that they thought it was important, either important or very important. So very few thought it wasn't important at all. Okay, so now this is an interesting one, because I often hear people will say to me, oh, we're carrying out a survey of children and they're probably bored, they don't like it. And in fairness, when we used to ask the children about did they enjoy taking part in Kids' Life and Times, a small proportion of them, around 5%, would have said it was a bit boring. And that's fair enough. Hold my hands up, and we have tried over the years to try and make things a little bit more interesting. But nonetheless, it is quite clear that children do want to take part in surveys. A little bit of maybe understanding of why that would be was Laura Lundy and Leslie Emerson carried out some research in 2007. And in fact, it was Laura who came to our first Kids' Life and Times advisory board and talked to us about doing an online survey, which we hadn't considered initially. But they did some research with working with P7 pupils in a consultation about how they wanted to be involved in school life. And the children argued quite strongly that, adults don't get asked to draw a picture. Children's views, they felt, were taken seriously if they were taking part in a survey, because that put them on a par then with adults. And they weren't being reduced to saying, will you draw a picture and tell me what that picture's about. So it's clear that they do feel that surveys offer them something. That's not to say that they all, and you can see there where the figure has dropped for the paper survey. It's clearly, there was over 50% had done paper surveys, but the figure for online surveys hasn't really changed. So they have been involved in them, and they think they should be involved in taking part in research in this way. But you see also they do like the creative ones, and a lot of children would say that the creative ones are really suitable for younger children. But I think to get a bit of kudos when you're P7, they want to be asked some kind of questions that would put them on a par with adults, taking part in focus groups or something else. So the last question we asked, so we left ourselves open here, what advice would you give to researchers who are going to work with children? And again, as Una had said, we had around 2,000 of the children gave us a response here. I've picked out quotes, as Una said, it's very difficult to get a overall sense of what the children are saying, and there needs a lot more work by a lot of people who are much more competent in doing this kind of analysis than I am. But what I was looking for was which quotes represented the kind of themes that appeared to be coming out of the data. One of the things that was very clear was this idea about trying to think what it was like to be a child. Don't assume that because you're an adult, and they were quite clear they didn't want to be patronised, they did not want to be, they didn't want people getting down with the kids but just to try and put yourself in their shoes. Remember what it was like, which is very hard for some of us by the time we've got to this age, but try and get a sense of what it's like, what they might like to answer, and what kind of research they might like to take part in. Over and over again, we got this thing about the questions, the type of questions, so ask some fun questions. Now again, that's relative. What I think might be a fun question, P7s may not. When we ask in Kids' Life and Times, some years we've asked, what would you like us to ask next year? And they've said, I'm assuming that the things that they like in terms of fun questions are things around your pets or your friends or what you like to do in your spare time. And we have included some of those as we go along through Kids' Life and Times from 2008. Things that are exciting, make it exciting, which, if you had all the funding in the world, you could make it really exciting. When we started Kids' Life and Times, we had animations, we had voices, we had music, even though the children thought the music was a bit dire, but nonetheless, we had something there. We had suggestions about putting in something more funky. Again, unfortunately, we couldn't afford it. But over the years, it's really difficult to keep it exciting and to get it you know, something that's interesting. We use these wee characters from Banging the Door, which is that Mike very kindly got us access to, which were very popular, I think, around 2008 when we started. And I think now children are they're so much more used to all of these animations, and that's the kind of thing that we think would be really good. So if anybody has any funding and they think they might like to just fund us a wee bit, that would be great. Interesting questions. Again, that's relative, you know, what is interesting. As we have to think about what is interesting for us in terms of policy making. What are the key things that we think are important to ask children, and to try and think about making those interesting. And that's where the work of the likes of Laura Lundy and the Centre for Children's Rights come in. Very, very rarely does anyone in the Centre for Children's Rights carry out research without having a Children's Research Advisory Group. And those advisory groups are where the children are able to help us as adults. They can help us develop questions for surveys. They're absolutely amazing. And any kind of other, what kind of questions should we be asking other children? So it's very clear when you build their capacity that they understand we're not saying, what kind of questions would you like, but what would other children like? So that's a real, you know, that's a real skill that the staff in the Centre for Children's Rights has, and all people working with children, small children. Ask them what they want to talk about, not what you want to talk about. So that sort of is around, quite a few of the children were saying this, that's around the kind of work I think that Mary Kellett does, which is child-led research, which is not actually what we do. So that's actually just saying to children, okay, if you could research anything, what is it that you would want? It's hard to sell that to funders. You know, we're going to ask them what they want, and they may want to research into their pets or the birds in the garden. But they're clear as to thinking about, again, going back to working with children's advisory groups, working with them to try and help you develop the kind of research. We don't do child-led research in the centre, but there's certainly something to be said for this, involving them in this. This was interesting because quite a lot of the time the children were saying things like, tell us why you want us to take part in your research. Don't just assume that just because we're children or we're in a school that you can just come in and ask us whatever you want to ask us. Tell us why. Explain why. Explain where the data is going to go to. Who's going to see this? So quite often we would now add in like what we would call a talking head. So we would have someone from in some of the surveys that I've been involved in, we had the David Ford, who we were asking the children about justice, and he gave a short presentation, and we put that at the start of the survey, he was saying this is very important to me. And the young people, they were about 14 or 15, but they really appreciated that. The fact that we had someone who was obviously listening, and that was a reason for them to take part in the research. So tell them why you're asking them. And the last thing was around making them feel comfortable when they're asking the questions. And I guess in terms of working with children, it's probably more around if you're doing things like focus groups or interviews, but even, I suppose, even if there's researchers there in terms of doing any kind of research with children and young people, this age group is about, they'll give you good information if they understand, if you make them comfortable, if you make them feel at ease. So there's a whole learning there in terms of the things that we need to do as adults when we're carrying out research with children to make them feel comfortable. And they understand that the more that they feel like that, the better the information that we are going to get as researchers. So it was a real learning experience, and I think Laura was very, we're meeting tomorrow to do some work on this. But it's very interesting at this stage to be giving the children. What our plan is to take these findings to our advisory group in the new academic year. They're usually around 9 or 10-year-olds. And they will help us develop this, understand where some of these responses are coming from, and what we need to do then to take that forward. Okay, so I think that is, so I've got a slide here with just some of the contact details for some of us. It's like Groundhog Day. We're now starting the 2019 surveys. They are being planned, so we just go from presenting the findings back out there straight away in getting the surveys ready for next year. So hopefully everything's going to go well, and we'll be able to, I think that Young Life and Times and Life and Times is already fully funded, so we're doing great this year. Dirk has just nearly finished writing a research update on Brexit. It will be based on a piece that we had in the conversation last month around the stuff that Una presented and children's attitudes to Brexit. Because we've always shied away from asking children in Kids' Life and Times about politics and politicians. But as you saw, the responses are amazing. And therefore, it is something we are not going to be scared to be asking them again. And any of the reports that we have are all made available on the ARC website. We have information there on who to contact if you're interested. Dirk is Young Life and Times, I'm Kids Life and Times, and for Martina is both. So if you can't get either of us, you'll get Martina, and she's just on the ball, she'll know. And there's all our social media, anything that you want to keep